Welcome everybody. So I think we should start. So let me first introduce our guest. So I could introduce Professor Eyal Winter officially, as it is in his CV. Professor of Economics, the University of Leicester, the Uniwersytetu Professor of Economics, the Center of the Study of Rationality, the Hebrew University. He was the chairman of the Economics Department, director of the Center of the Study of Rationality. He was awarded the Humboldt Prize for Excellence in Research. And his research papers were published in the main academic outlets such as Econometrica or the American Economic Review. He published a lot of press essays. He also advised government and companies. But let me do it from my own perspective. So I was a PhD student at European University Institute in Florence in 2005-2010. And before that, Eyal was professor of economics there, 2001 and 2002. And the rumor among the students was that he was a very friendly professor. So in 2007, I applied to the 18th Jerusalem Summer School in Economic Theory. And Eyal was then the chairman of the economics department. And he had to approve my application, which he did, luckily for me. Then I liked the school so much that I applied again the year after. And this was really nice, again, really nice summer school. In 2008, Eyal was then the director of the Center of the Study of Rationality, so he had to approve my application again. So this summer school hosted 6 Nobel Prize winners in economics, so we had a very good opportunity to interact with them, to go to trips together. So the summer school was fantastic, both scientifically. This was the economics of Kenneth Arrow. And also socially. So we went with Eric Maskin to Masada tour. We also had some nice social events. And during the same time, in 2008, I noticed an announcement of a research seminar that took place in the center that Eyal was the director, the Center for the Study of Rationality. And this was the presentation that influenced my academic life later on, because I worked on this is the presentation of Sergio Hart, Operational Measure of Riskiness. I worked on this topic for a couple of years. I was really attracted by the fact that scientists from many different fields, such as mathematicians, biologists, computer scientists, lawyers, they could all sit together and really focus on the problem instead of focusing on the titles they have, on the, let's say, differences in approaches and so on. So I was really this was a really nice experience for me. And there is a saying that where there are 2 poles, there are 3 opinions. And I think with great economies, it's not that different. So they often have conflicting views, especially when it comes to discussing rationality. What is rational, what is not. Yet there are notable exceptions. And one of them was during the summer school that 6 Nobel Prize winners and a number of other excellent researchers, they all agreed that Kenneth Arrow is a father of modern economics. But the second exception that I came across was that several Nobel Prize winners and many others agreed that the book of Eyal Winter, Feeling Smart, is a fantastic book. So this is why. Feeling Smart, the book by Professor Winter, was originally written in Hebrew but translated into 6 languages. What is not here is the recent Turkish edition. And let me say just one word of introduction. So the economics profession can very roughly be divided into 2 camps. This is very rough. So rationality camp that might be represented by Robert Aumann, Nobel Prize winner in economics, and also one of the founders of the Center of the Study of Rationality, who represents the classical normative approach. And it can be stated that people behave as if they were optimizing. Whereas there is also what I call an irrationality camp, represented by behavioral economics, behavioral descriptive approach, And the main statement is people are not econs. An econ is a fictional creature called Homo economicus that populates standard economic models. They say that they are irrational, often make mistakes, and have emotions. But Eyal's book touches on this debate, on the central point of this debate. He asked the question, maybe emotions are not irrational as often claimed. So that's why I think this book might be very interesting. And I wanted to say that Professor Eyal Winter is certainly not a typical econ. As you can see on this picture, and also there is a YouTube version that I found on his website that he sings a nice love song in a Spanish dialect, Ladino, the Jewish dialect that was spoken in Spain. So, to finish, on behalf of the organizers of the research seminar that we organized with Łukasz Woźny, on behalf of Decision Support and Analysis Division that I am part of it, we invite you to listen to the exciting lecture given by Professor Eyal Winter. Thank you.
Thank you, Micha. Thank you for facilitating this event. I'm delighted to be here. Coming to Poland was long on my agenda, but never found an opportunity and never the time to do it. And now I'm here for the first time in my life, and I'm very excited. Very excited, and I want to thank you and Micha and everybody else that allowed me to speak here. I'm going to speak about the book, as Micha said, but in fact I'm going to start and tell you how I came to write this book. Micha mentioned that I was the director of the Center for the Study of Rationality for a few years, which is indeed the case, and during my term as the director, I had an opportunity to speak with people coming from different disciplines. As Micha told, the center itself is interdisciplinary. It has economists, people who are doing business administration, mathematicians, political scientists, sociologists, philosophers, psychologists, people who do law, and even people who do evolutionary biology. And all of us are looking at decision-making and rationality each one through its own perspective, through its own angle, through its own telescope or microscope. But it's an environment that allows us to talk with each other and indeed to write papers together. And during my term as a director, I had a lot of opportunity to speak to people and hear their opinions and research outcomes about various interesting or very crucial topics in rationality. And I felt that I want to summarize this experience by writing a book that will mainly deal with my own contribution and that of my co-author, but also from other people from my own field, but also from people from outside the field of economics. I collaborated with people from law, from computer science, through the years on computer science on more mathematical issue, but also with psychologists on more experimental topics. And while thinking about writing a book on rationality, it occurs to me that to understand rationality, we first have to understand what we regard as the total opposite of rationality, which is emotions. Okay? And I was starting by thinking on two very standard conventional wisdom, something that most of us believe in. And indeed, a few decades ago, almost all the scientists in psychology or even people who are doing brain research thought that this is the case. But now we understand that these two conventional wisdoms are totally wrong. And I'll tell you about this conventional wisdom. Let me jump. The first conventional wisdom is that when we make decisions, we engage two different boxes in our brain, okay? One is the rational box, and the other one is the emotional box. And these boxes are separate, they don't communicate, or if they communicate, they even fight with one another. And eventually one of them wins, and if it's the right side box that wins, we make a rational decision. If the left side box wins, we make an emotional decision. This is a very wrong picture of how we make decisions. We don't have two boxes in our brain, and we can't even separate the entire process of decision making that involves both rationality and emotions, okay? In fact, rationality and emotion are very tightly connected, entangled, okay? And in fact, there is no one decision that we make that doesn't involve both rationality and emotion. Even if you think about the most material decision when you enter the supermarket and you are facing two products, and eventually you send your hand, you grab to one of them, the last trigger, the final trigger that makes you choose one over the other is an emotional trigger, okay? It precedes an elaborate process of both analysis and emotions, right? So you invoke analysis definitely by looking at the products, looking at, for instance, how much fat it has, how much calories it contains, whether it's good for you or bad for you, how much it costs, whether the price makes sense to you or not. These are all analytical kind of cognitive activities, right? But any piece of information that you get and you analyze cognitively is then translated to some sort of an emotional reaction that either incentivizes you to do more research on the product and maybe acquire more information, or eventually when you're convinced enough that this is the one that you want to take, then it generates again this last emotional trigger that makes you want one of them over the other, okay? So it's really not a situation in which it's more, I would describe the way rationality and emotions are working more in a way of dialogue, in a way of conversation. One reinforces the other, okay? It's not only when we work well with our brain, okay? It's also the case that, for instance, people who treat, psychiatrists and psychologists who treat people with depression characterize them as having something that they call rumination. What is rumination? Rumination is this process by which you think about bad things over and over again, trying to analyze, trying to ask questions about it, and can't leave the subject no matter what happens. And this process of rumination has a similar collaboration, this time a very unfortunate collaboration between emotions and rationality. You are thinking about the bad issue, you're trying to figure out why is it that I'm unsuccessful, why is it that my love left me, or trying to analyze by even questions that cannot be analyzed, cannot be given an answer. And each such analysis triggers emotions again that then trigger more incentive to think about it and so forth and so on. Okay, so this is the way we use generally rationality and emotion in both the positive things that we engage with as well as the negative ones. Okay, so we are talking more about this kind of situation, not about separation, but collaboration between rationality and emotions. The other conventional wisdom, which is also wrong, and many of us believe in, is that emotions are, generally speaking, are very bad for us, okay? Are bad for us in way of making decisions. We often feel that if we could make decisions by invoking only rationality and shut down our emotional brain, we would have come to better decision. We would have done better. Don't know if you remember this character from Star Trek, Mr. Spock. It was famous Mr. Spock, who came from outer space, was capable of really shutting down his emotional being. And work only based on his reasoning. And when we look at it, we often have this craving to be like Mr. Spock. And we regret the fact that we cannot do it. We cannot shut down our emotional being. And this is also wrong. Emotions, to a large extent, help us make decisions, both in the individual level and on the interactive level. Okay? In my book, I make a distinction between emotions that I call autonomous emotions. These are emotions that you can experience without having somebody in front of you. Okay? You don't need another human being to experience these emotions. We're talking, for instance, about sadness or about fear. Okay? You can experience fear autonomously. You don't need somebody else to be around. But many, many emotions, which I call interactive emotions, require somebody else to experience them. Think about anger. You have to be angry at somebody. You have embarrassment. You have to be embarrassed in front of somebody. Empathy. You have to feel empathy towards somebody. Okay, all these emotions can be thought of either as a social emotions or interactive emotion. And the difference between them and autonomous is that somebody else has to be around. Okay? And much of the gains that we attribute, that we get from involving emotions in our decision making comes from the fact that in interactive situations, emotions don't only affect our decisions, but they also affect the other party decision. Okay? And very often, and I would say even in most cases, and it all depends on the volume of the emotion. If the emotion is totally uncontrolled and extreme, it could very well work against us. But if it's moderate and controlled, in most cases it works for us. Okay? And I'm going to give you two examples, two prominent examples that I mentioned in the book of experiments that took place like several decades ago. Okay? And I'm going to talk about an emotion that we all regard as being a negative emotion, which is called anger. Okay? And here is an experiment that was conducted, as I said, several decades ago, where subjects were asked to negotiate the division of some monies that they were given. Okay? So the experimenters collected a bunch of students in California, divided them to pairs, gave them some money, told them that they have 20 minutes to discuss how to divide the money. There was basically some sort of story behind this money that made the situation unsymmetric, so that they won't divide the money simply 50-50, so that they will have something to negotiate on. And they were sent into the room to start the negotiation. But before they were sent into the room, half of them were going through a manipulation that made them slightly more angry than the rest. Okay? How do you make somebody artificially more angry? There are two techniques that psychologists like to do. One of them is very, very, very much unrecommended, which is to get the subject to come half an hour earlier to the experiment and let them wait half an hour before you open the lab. That will make many of them furious, but in a very unfair way. The other technique, which is not less effective, is to ask them to write down on a piece of paper an experience that they had, let's say in the last 2 or 3 years, that made them really furious. They made them angry. And some of my colleagues at the Hebrew University are doing experiments like this, and I have visited these experiments several times, and it's amazing. You see the guy, you see a person write down, so he starts very relaxed. He writes the first few lines very relaxed, and as he continues, or she continues, down the road, you start seeing that they become red, and sometimes sweaty, and you need to get them relaxed a little bit because sometimes they are overreacting, okay? So they, as I told you in this experiment, they got half of the people to enter the lab with a higher level of anger. And what they found out after the negotiation is that those people who entered the lab with a higher level of anger, these people also left the lab with a higher level of money, okay? So anger turned out to be something useful for them. And we'll get really very soon to the question, where is it coming from, okay? Why did they do better, those angry people, okay? But let me before tell you about another experiment. This other experiment does not involve negotiation, but something similar, debating, where you take a bunch of people to discuss an issue which is controversial, something like death penalty or abortion, and you do the same manipulation. Half of them enter with a higher level of anger, and then psychologists wrote down all the arguments that people have raised during the debating, and what they found out, that those who entered the debate with a higher level of anger were better capable of distinguishing between relevant argument and irrelevant argument for the discussion, okay? So to some extent, these people who were slightly angry managed to be even cognitively better than the others, okay? And to some extent, it is even less surprising, because when you're angry, we know, the level of adrenaline in your body goes up, and adrenaline wakes us up, okay? We are alert, we are motivated. Anger motivates us anyhow to do something because we are in a state that we want to get out of, right? And we are motivated to do something to make us feel better, and while if we are relaxed and feel good, so we are less motivated to do something, okay? So this is less surprising. But let's go back to the experiment, the first experiment, and the bargaining experiment. Ask yourself, how come those people that entered with a slightly higher level of anger made better? And this has to do with the concept, a very important concept, called commitment, okay? It's a very old concept in economics, but not only in economics, also in political science. And commitment refers to strategic situations, okay, where you willingly tie your hands behind your back to reduce your options, and by doing so, you enhance or improve your strategic situation. This sounds weird. How can you improve your strategic situation by reducing your option, by tying your hands behind your back? Okay? So let me give you a very, very nice example that one of my historian friends told me, which is about the Roman legions chasing after the German tribes over the Rhine, okay, during their battles. Very often they used to burn the bridges behind them, okay? What do you do when you burn the bridge behind you? You actually reduce the option of going back, okay? So you limit your options. But you limit your option in a way that to some extent makes you better off, because you're capable of signaling to your enemy, listen, I have no way going back. There's no return from me. which means I'm going to fight until the end. And that usually will make the enemy cave in much faster than without this signal, okay? Emotions very often play exactly the same role. Emotion forces us tying our hands behind our back in a way that increase our strategic strength, okay? In the case of bargaining that I just told you about, what really happens is that those people who were slightly more angry could demonstrate very convincingly that they are not going to accept a humiliating offer. If you offer me that much, I'm insulted and I'm angry. And if I'm angry and insulted, in fact, my hands are tied behind my back. And in spite of the fact that financially walking out of the negotiation is a bad thing, I have no option. My state of mind instructs me to leave the bargaining stage and leave you alone, okay? If I had been super rational, very cold-minded, okay, and say this is a not sufficient offer and I'm considering leaving the bargaining situation, the other party would say, no, you won't leave because you still get more than what you can get without this offer. So you have no reason to leave. It's not rational for you to leave, okay? But if I'm not cold and super rational, but rather more emotional, and I say, listen, I know that this offer is better for me financially than leaving the bargaining, but I'm so pissed off about the situation, I can't, it's basically not up to me. My hands are tied behind my back. This is what emotions are doing in many social situations, and this is the way they developed evolutionarily to some extent to serve us in strategic situations, okay? And this is to some extent the reason that in many strategic situations we can, I would say, artificially invoke emotions, synthesize emotions. I will tell you a little bit about experiments that we did at our lab to prove it. But maybe before that, let me take you through a thought experiment, not something that we really done, but something that I want you to think about, how you would have behaved in such a situation. And I'm going to take you through two different scenarios of the story that I'm going to tell very soon, and ask you to sort of assess your state of mind, the feelings that you would have had in these two different scenarios, and whether these two different scenarios would have invoked different feelings in you, okay? So here is a story. You find yourself at the airport after a conference or let's say a vacation, and you need to go back to Warsaw, and you're told at the airport that your flight was canceled and that you will have to report a day later. You have to go to the hotel. They'll provide an hotel for you, but you'll have to report a day later and you'll get your flight. Usually when I tell it to my students, if they are at the age of this part of the audience, they will say, great, yeah, so another day of vacation, unpaid vacation, yeah? Good news, but for most of us, this would be very, very bad news, right? Now I want to take you to two different scenarios. In scenario A, you look around you and you see people reacting in a quite apathic way to the news, okay? They're not protesting. And the loudspeaker reports that there are buses waiting for you outside to take you to the hotel. You see the other people packing their stuff, intending to leave the terminal. And what you say to yourself is that it's a done deal. There's nothing that I can do here, okay? There's no way I can change my fate under these circumstances. I would assume that under this scenario, you wouldn't be so angry. if I have to characterize the feeling that you will feel, it's probably frustration that you may lose you won't make it to your spouse's birthday, or you'll be late for your next day class, or whatever. Frustration or sadness, okay? But now let me take you through a different story, so a different scenario. And in this second scenario, what you see is somebody, let's for that purpose take Micha, and Micha is telling me, listen, Eyal, I was so angry about the situation. I went to the airline company desk and I hit their desk and say, this is not the way you should treat your customers. And I deserve a better service from you. And I told them, you know, if you are not rerouting me to a different flight, as I think you should do, I'm going to sue the company. And he tells me, you know, Eyal, it worked out. Now they rerouted me to a different airline, and I'm going to be back home in a few hours. This, instead of the first situation, would make me furious, and many of you as well. Okay? And the main difference between scenario A and scenario B is that in scenario B, you encounter opportunity for your emotional state to change the situation. You realize that anger may be something that benefits you. Okay? And it is likely that you will go, like Micha, to the desk of the airline, maybe raise your voice a little bit, not too much, because if you start shouting at the personnel there, they will simply react by saying, you know, if you talk with me like this, I'm going to call the security, and they will remove you out of the terminal. Okay? So your instinct, your insights will sort of figure out what's the right level of anger to get most benefits out of this situation. And you are likely to act in this manner. Okay? So this is what I call synthesizing emotions. Okay? I have, other than this general reader book, I have several more serious game theoretic papers that define a concept, equilibrium concept, with other people that has been published in well-known outlets in the profession, and they deal with really the more technical theory that explain how you can incorporate emotions into a game theoretic concept. Okay, so in this notion, you don't only choose strategies, but you somehow choose also your state of mind. And unlike standard Nash equilibrium concept where your strategy has to be best respond to the other person's strategy, in this concept, also your state of mind has to be best respond to the other person's states of mind. So I'm not going to go technical, so I'm not going to elaborate on this, but those of you who want will have an opportunity to read about these ideas in more depth. Okay, but let's go back to this story, okay? Why is it that it turned out to be effective, to be a little angry in this airport example? The reason is it's the same story as before. If I would have said in a perfect rational way and calm-minded to this employee, listen, my name is Eyal Winter, I am super rational, hello, nice to meet you. I think I don't get the service I deserve, and therefore I'm going to sue the company. If I reacted this way, nobody would have taken it seriously, right? Think of it, I mean, to sue the company takes so much time and effort and potentially money. To do all this for this trivial matter of a delay in the flight would not make sense for a rational person, right? On the other hand, if I say, listen, and I demonstrate, I'm so fed up, I'm so furious about the way I'm treated, I know that it's going to take me time and effort, but I'm so angry about the way you treat me that I basically don't have a choice. I will sue the company in spite of the fact that it doesn't make sense for me financially. Okay? Okay, so again, if this reaction is too overwhelmed, then there would be a similar response by the employee. He or he would say, listen, I know that I have to serve you, that's my duty, and I'd be sucked if I don't give you good service, but the way you speak to me is so degrading and humiliating that I'm not willing to talk to you anymore. Okay? And I know that I may get into trouble with my managers, but my hands are also tied behind my back. Okay? So eventually it's a game. It's a game, but it's a serious game. It's a serious game to the extent that we don't fabricate it. Even emotions that are sort of synthesized in the way that I described to you are genuine, are real, okay? By the way, if you ask actors how they get themselves to cry on stage when the scene requires it, they almost always will tell you that they are not acting. They're really crying. They're really in the state of mind that make them cry. Okay, and that they would say that they can't fake crying. You can't intentionally make your tears go out. There's no way. There's no biological way to do it. You must be endowed in the state of mind that will facilitate it. And they have all sorts of technique of doing it. For instance, matching the situation on stage to something personal that happened to them in the past that will basically retrieve the same emotions, genuine emotions that they experience on stage. The will experience on stage will allow them to cry, okay? And very often we are doing the same thing, okay? Let me tell you about an experiment that I did with a psychologist colleague of mine at the Hebrew University, with the attempt to see whether we could generate these synthetic emotions in the lab. Basically asking the question, can we incentivize people to experience emotions? Okay? Can incentive affect emotions? We know very often from behavioral economic literature that emotions can affect incentives. Okay? Economic incentive may be distorted by emotions. Okay? For instance, a person who sees a beggar on the street who is blind in a corner, some dark corner where nobody is, would have a financial incentive to grab his money and disappear. That's the economic incentives, okay? But none of us would do something like that. And the reason is that our emotions distort our economic incentives. And what we wanted to investigate is whether we have the same situation, same relationship, but in the opposite direction. Whether incentives also can affect emotions. And what we did, we used a machine called skin conductance. Skin conductance is a machine that can read emotions. It's a machine that we connect it to the skin and reads two signals from the body, physiological signals. One is the humidity of the body, the conductance of the body, which has to do with the humidity and how much sweaty we become, okay? Which we know the more emotionally arousal we are, the skin has a higher level of conductance, okay? And the other one is heartbeats. And it measures these two signals in different periods, before and after the stimulus. And then there is another technique, which is complementary technique, where questionnaires that have nothing to do with the situation that they are engaging in. People ask questions about the questionnaire involves lotteries, which kind of lottery you would prefer, hypothetical situation of punishing people, what kind of punishment you would give for that and that violation. And this questionnaire, which psychologists are using decades now, is capable of identifying exactly what emotions you are experiencing, to distinguish between, let's say, anger from fear or from happiness or from other emotions. Okay, so it's the machine, it's the skin conductance, the physiology, and the response to the questionnaire that tells us what are you really experiencing, which emotion you are experiencing, and at which level. Okay? And then we formed 3 groups. In group A, in all these 3 groups, we got people again to play in pairs, some sort of game, in which one player behavior towards the other could affect the other person's payoff. Okay? And then we divided them to 3 groups. In group A, we told the subjects, listen, we have a way to measure how angry you are from the way you are treated by your counterpart, by your partner. And the more angry you will be, the more you will be compensated by us. We don't want to leave you angry. Okay? In group B, we said almost the same thing. We said the same thing, but with respect to happiness. We have a way to measure how happy you are, how satisfied you are with the way you are treated by your other party. Okay? And the more happy you will be, the more you will be rewarded by us, in addition to what you get in the game. Okay? In group C, we just told them we have a way to measure your emotional reaction towards the way you're treated by your counterpart, but it's not going to affect your payoff. We are not going either to pay you anything, nor to distract from your payoff. Okay? And what we found out, that the objective measurements, it's not what people reported, it's what we saw as their emotional state. The level of anger to certain type of behaviors by the other players were much, much more prominent, very significant, statistically significant in the group where they were motivated to be angry, in the first group, compared with the second and the third one. Okay, so if we incentivized them to be angry, and indeed they were very angry. In the second group, the level of happiness was slightly higher than in the 2 other groups, but not statistically significant. Okay? Which may suggest, for instance, that it's harder to incentivize people to become happy than to become angry. It's pretty bad, pretty unfortunate, right? It would have been nice if small payoffs would have worked to make people much happier, right? I'm sure there would have been policies by governments to use these techniques. But it doesn't work as effectively as it does with anger. Okay? There could be we speculated 2 reasons for it in the paper. One is the ceiling effect. I mean, we're talking about young students. And young students in good schools like your school are usually happy, no matter in which state, what happens around them, unless they are failing an exam. But that's a temporary sadness. But other than that, they're happy. Okay, so they are entering already with a relatively high level of happiness. If you are close to the ceiling, it's hard to affect it. Okay. The other possibility is that, again, and this is more an evolutionary interpretation, as I said, all our emotions were were designed by evolution to serve some purpose, okay? And it turns out that anger is much more effective, useful emotion for us than happiness. Although we feel much better with happiness, anger serves us better, okay? Because when we are angry, as we said, we want to change something, we are motivated, we are thinking in depth about what we can do to stop this feeling, okay? Whereas when we are happy, we are basically incentivized to go to the beach and enjoy ourselves rather than finding something useful to do. Let me give you a last interpretation, which is more practical, of the suggestion that I was saying, that we often generate emotions synthetically. I was, as Micha said, for a couple of years, the chairman of the economics department in the Hebrew University, and one of the things we were debating for years is the procedure for appealing on exam. I'm sure you have the same thought about it, but we had really for many years really an extreme liberal procedure by which students could change the marks. Change the mark meaning getting higher marks. And they first appeal to the professor or the assistant. If it doesn't work, they appeal to the professor. If it doesn't work, they appeal to the chairman. If it doesn't work, they appeal to the dean. And you know, every authority could revert a decision by somebody else. And the reason why it worked badly was that we saw these students confronting first with the assistant, then with always face to face, and really you saw emotions that are very extreme, either anger, but mostly deep sadness, which were not fabricated, which are completely genuine, but yet was to some extent generated because of the situation of facing somebody who can affect your mark. Okay? And in some case, this happened in, I think the UK also has quite relaxed rules about it. In one case, a student at Leicester had to be removed with an ambulance because she fainted during this interaction. And so we experimented different regimes, and we tried, of course, the right to appeal is a basic right. We can't extract it from students, but you can make the rules more lenient or more rigid. And our feeling was, by experimenting with the rules, is that the more rigid, more rigorous, more constrained you make them, the more happy the students are at the end of the year. Okay? Quite counterintuitive, right? And the reason again is that if they don't find themselves in this situation in which somebody can affect the marks, they won't get into these emotional states. Okay? And very often we don't pay attention to it. I want to tell you about where we do this interaction between rationality and emotions. This is the part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. This is the most recent part of the brain that evolved. The brain basically started to evolving from its internal parts, from the insula and the amygdala, and then expanded to this cortex area, and the prefrontal cortex is the last one. And it's basically the area, first of all, it's the area in which most of the interaction between rationality and emotion, between analysis and emotion, is taking place. How do we know it? Because now we can actually do fMRI experiments. You can put people, when they make decisions, under the brain scan and see which is the part of the brain that is most active. And if you think of it, what would be the kind of decision that involves interaction between rationality and emotion in the most intensive way? Anyone want to speculate? Yes? A breakup. Generally social issues, romantic issues, definitely. But there's another domain of issues that invoke very intensive interaction between rationality and emotions, and these are moral issues, right? If you're thinking about whether something is moral or not, you first invoke emotion usually in way of empathy, or most moral dilemmas have some victim in it, okay? And so in order to decide whether the thing that has been done to this person is moral or not, you have to develop some sort of empathy towards this person. But you also have to do analysis, because if you think about it, when you ask yourself moral questions, very often you do comparisons to figure out whether something is moral or not. You think about a similar situation, let's call it situation A, which makes clear that a person did something wrong. It's very similar to situation B, which you are facing now. And you draw from your insight on situation A, you draw a conclusion on situation B. And you say, if this is immoral here, this must be also immoral here. Okay? Okay, so these are, and indeed if you let people, if you face people with moral dilemmas while they are under the fMRI scanning, you see that most of the activity of the brain takes place in this part of the brain. Okay, this part of the brain is consuming the highest level of oxygen, and this consumption of oxygen is highlighted by the machine. Okay. So we talked about anger. I talked a little bit about behavioral economics using only one direction, and we try to introduce the other direction, how emotion affect incentives, and we are trying to also ask questions about how incentives affect emotions. And now I want to take you to a second dilemma, again, in way of showing that emotions are rational. I may give some other examples later about the role of other emotions and why they are rational. But I want to take you first through an issue which is also refuting something that we associate with an emotional behavior and also with irrational behavior, which is giving, or more generally, altruistic behavior. Altruistic behavior is something that is a serious dilemma, a serious riddle, both to economists as well as to evolutionary biologists. Okay? You know, standard economics, I mean, if you take the most narrow approach to neoclassical economics, you will be contradicting altruistic behavior, because if you're trying to maximize your resources, then giving without getting something in return is irrational. Okay? From evolutionary biology point of view, it's very much the same, because evolutionary biology talks about fitness and selection, and fitness is very much determined by the amount of resources that you have. Okay, so if you take your own resources and give it to someone else, you are decreasing your fitness and increasing his fitness. Okay, so it's again something that has to have some answer. And I'm going to give you two different answers which depend on the kind of altruism that we are making as human beings. Not every giving behavior has the same explanation, and quite surprisingly, much of the insights about giving behavior is coming to us economists with the help of biologists, and this is where I started hearing about these explanations, talking with my evolutionary biologist colleagues. Okay, so the insights are coming from the animal world. Okay, and I'm going to give you two examples. This cockatoo is an amazing bird. They are flying in big flocks and makes them susceptible to predators, or big eagles that try to hunt them. Okay? And what happens in these flocks is that one of the males in the flock quite spontaneously declare himself to become the guard of the flock. What does it mean that you are the guard of the flock? It means two things. First of all, you're flying above the rest of the birds, okay, so that you could see the surrounding, okay? And flying above the rest of the flock requires more energy, so you're already giving something. But not only that, if you see an eagle coming by, you shout, you scream very loudly, the flock spread away, and if somebody is going to be eaten, it's most likely the guard. He remains there until everybody else disappears to make sure that no one stays, okay? It's absolutely weird. Why should he do something like that? Why should evolution generate instinct? Because, you know, birds don't think too much. They're operating by instinct. Why should an instinct like that be part of the behavior of this bird? I'm going to explain it. Here's another bird. These birds live in desert areas, in places where food and water are very scarce. They're very common in Israel, in south of Israel, in the Negev desert. We see them a lot, and indeed they were investigated very thoroughly by Israeli bird scientists. And what they found out again quite amazing giving behavior of these birds. So when these birds form nests, of course, like any bird, and the female is sitting on the eggs in the nest to warm them up until they broken and the offspring is coming out of them. And the male would go and look for food. And when the male finds food and come back to the flock, he won't put all his food in the nest of his own offspring. Rather than that, he would go to the other nest and put part of it in the other nests as well. Okay? Sometimes the female has to join him because things are too bad and the two of them need to go and search for food. And she's obliged to neglect the eggs and join the male in the search of food. Very often, a different bird in the flock will jump into her nest and take the job of warming the eggs. It's like we used to call it the kibbutz society. It's a kumun, right? They all sharing. It's again quite pose a serious dilemma to biologists because of fitness. If you want, it's clear why you want your own offspring to survive, because they are the mean by which you transmit your own genetic profile to the next generation. But why should you care about other offsprings. Okay?
No other flock.
Sorry?
There is no offspring, there is no flock. So
If there is no offspring, no flock, yeah. So here in fact, the explanation is much simpler than the first one, because it's not enough that there is no flock. It's because if you adopt the idea of the selfish gene, then there need to be some sort of family relatives, okay? So indeed, all the flock is related to some extent. They are all remote relatives of one another, okay? And the reason why you don't put all the food in your own nest, which are the immediate offspring of you, the children, your children, is that it's if you are buying an insurance policy. If your kids won't survive, if your own children won't survive, then by giving to others, you increase the chances that your, let's say, cousin will survive, your second cousin will survive, your second nephew will survive. They all have a genetic profile somewhat different than yours, much more different than your kids have, but it still provide the birth with the security that it will contribute something in the next generation's genetic profile. Okay? This is, by the way, something that relates to us human beings. This preference to give to people who are somewhat related to us, even ethnically, more than people who are not ethnically related to us, is something that we economists have known for some time. There is a very nice paper by Jim Andrioni, who is an economist in University of Michigan, where he investigated the giving behavior in American communities. Do you know that it's very common in the US during Christmas to write a check for the community, a donation for the community, in most cases for schools, okay? So what Jim Andrioni did, he decided that he wants to see the effect of the ethnic variation within communities on the willingness to give for the communities, okay? So he formed a measure of ethnic diversity within communities, okay? And he collected data of hundreds of communities across the United States, measured each community by using his measure of ethnic diversity. And what he found out, which very much relates to the behavior of this bird, is that if you take two communities and one of them measure of diversity is greater than the other by, let's say, 10%, then the community with the higher level of ethnic diversion, you'll see a 15% less contribution by the people within the community. So the more diverse the group is, the less willingness of people within the community to contribute. And there are also supporting experiments done by psychologists that show it. For instance, if you take subject in the United States and you pretend yourself to be a charity organization that collect money for poor children, okay, in the United States, and you know, one of the tricks to get people donate is that you show them the exact person that is going to enjoy this money, this donation. You tell them, you see this picture? We're going to give it to this child. This $10 or $20 that you are putting is going to go directly to this child, okay? And you can manipulate this experiment by giving, let's say, pictures of black kids to white donors, as opposed, or also picture of white kids to black donors. And indeed, white donors donate more to white kids than black kids, and black donors donate more to black kids than white kids. Okay? So overall, people like to spend the money on individual in a monotonic way. The more close they are to you, obviously kids are the closest, and then more remote family member, then the ethnic group, and then perhaps the nation. Okay? That's the insight we get here. But what do we get? How can we explain this type of behavior? Okay, we could use the same thing, but indeed here the explanation, I mean the giving is so phenomenal that it requires an additional explanation, and there is an additional explanation. This additional explanation built on the idea of a very interesting idea that came to the world by both an economist and a biologist. First, I think by a biologist by the name of Zehavi, who investigated these birds. He was also using it, not for these birds, he investigated a lot of these birds, but he was using it to explain these birds as well, the peacock. And he called it the handicap principle, okay? So his first attempt to explain his idea was to answer the question, why do peacocks have such a big tail? And biologists thought that there is nothing, no advantage they could actually attribute to this big tail. Only disadvantages. You know, it prevents him from running fast, escaping predators, chasing after food, mating, everything that these guys are doing is more difficult with this huge tail. Okay? But then why do they have this huge tail? And Zehavi said, because of the handicap principle. What is the handicap principle? He was actually saying, look, this disadvantage is actually an advantage. Because what do peacock really interested in? Females, obviously. And what do you need in order to get the best female, and as much as you can, is to sort of give a credible signal about your the quality of your genes, right? Now, with this huge tail, they can actually signal, listen, I have such a huge tail. It's a handicap. It's put me in a burden. It's a burden. But in spite of this huge burden, I'm actually doing everything quite well. Look at this tiny peacock over there at the corner. There's a tiny, tiny tail. He's not doing anything better than I can do. Okay? That means that I have so many other traits that compensate for this big tail, and which you as a female should be interested in, because they are much more important than the disadvantage caused by my tail. Okay, and indeed, what they found that these peacock with big tails get more females to mate with, and indeed the most healthy female. Okay, and this handicap principle, which I'll very soon tell you about the very identical idea that was contributed by an economist, a famous economist. Let me go back before that to this bird and tell you why it's basically solved the problem with this bird. Because serving as a guard, doing precisely the same job, okay? It actually can signal females that in spite of the fact that I'm putting my life in risk and I'm flying high, I can do it. Not everybody, I can afford it. Not everybody can afford doing what I'm doing. And this generates a signal that makes them more valuable in the mating market, and indeed better off. Okay? Notice that unlike the peacock, whose signal is completely social waste, nobody is benefiting actually from the big tail that he has grown for himself, right? On the other hand, this bird uses signal to do something good for the community, for the flock. Okay, so there's another force here that comes in, which is what we call the group selection, on top of the standard evolutionary selection, by means that they are taking care of the group, and therefore this group, this species, managed to survive much longer. Okay? Now, this is actually where Michael Spence should come in. Michael Spence is a famous economist who got the Nobel Prize, I think, about 15 or 20 years. And he introduced a whole theory of signaling that also was based on the idea that if we are taking an action which is costly to us, for instance, like giving, for instance, like studying very hard in a very lucrative university, in spite of the fact that we don't get something concrete out of it, we always get something in terms of signaling others that we are capable of doing it. And this is what makes us enjoy giving, because by giving, we can demonstrate our surrounding that we can afford doing it. Not everybody can do. Not everybody can give. Okay? This is the immediate benefit that we acquire. So this is the rationality. Something that we think that we're getting nothing out of it. In fact, we do get something out of it. I think there are many other examples in which the handicap principle penetrates our life without us being aware of it at all. I think also in terms of fashion. If you ask yourself, where did this habit of wearing a tie came from? Okay? I think part of it is the handicap principle. When you have a tie, you actually strangle yourself. And you're capable to say, I'm strangling myself and still can make sense of what I'm talking about. Where do high heels for women came from? Well, women here can attest that it's not very easy to walk with high heels, especially if on grounds which is unstable. But by doing so, you could demonstrate stability, coordination, all sorts of things. Okay, so very often the fashion that we adopt is a mean to signal ability in very much the same way that these birds are doing. Okay. What I want to do now, let me see. I want to talk a little bit. When did we start?
12.
Start 12. Okay, I still have some time. I want to talk a little bit about the mechanism. Just one more example about giving and diversity I mentioned. A few years ago, I was asked by the Norwegian government to join a forum of economists that wanted that the Norwegian government formed in order to basically do some marketing to this Scandinavian economic system, which we all know is a very social oriented. Okay, and seeing life in Oslo, in Norway, I was very impressed by this economy, especially with the aspect of no showing off. No showing off is one of the most characteristic traits of of the Norwegian education. Okay? Kids learn to avoid boasting about their achievements, about their family, about anything. Okay? And if you and it grows and it prevails with age. I mean, if you take two individuals, one is a simple clerk working for the government, and the other one is a very wealthy entrepreneur or CEO of a big company, you will find it hard, even looking at the car they're driving, at their homes, at the restaurant they spend time, to distinguish between the two. Okay? Because they do really, in terms of income, they have huge differences, but in terms of consumption, they look very much similar. Not only that, Norway is the country with the highest level of tax, but at the same time also the lowest level of tax evasion. People literally enjoy paying taxes there. Okay? And if other countries could adopt it, it seems like an ideal society. But then I raised question, and the question I raised is whether the advantages behind this economy is coming from the rules or the success of this economy. And indeed, it's not only equality, it's also wealth. It's a very wealthy country, and nobody is basically, everybody is doing well, so to say. Whether this success is coming from the rules of the economy, from the rules of the game, I would say, or perhaps it's coming from the culture behind the rule, from the people behind the rule. Okay? And indeed, my insight was that, if you know, all the Scandinavian nations started from a small core of tribes that emerged to become nations, and were had a very, very low ethnical diversity until like 50 or 70 years, when the huge immigration from developing countries started flowing into the country. Okay, and because they were ethnically very similar, they could maintain an economy like this. But if you take, for instance, the US or some countries in Europe where there's huge diversity, and precisely as the experiment or the research by Jim Andrioni shows, it's very hard to generate these preferences to our taxes when the society is diverse. Now, divergence doesn't for divergence to create disincentive to pay taxes. It's you don't need the divergence to be on ethnical level. It could be on cultural level. For instance, in Israel, ethnically, the Israelis are very, very similar to one another. Yet culturally, they're very different. I mean, there is a huge difference between Orthodox and non-Orthodox, between people of different religions. Although people of different religions, for instance, Israeli Jews who came from Poland, for instance, for many generations, would have a much more similar profile to that of a Palestinian who lived in Palestine for centuries. Then it's much more identical than if you compare the same person with somebody in Poland. Okay? And yet, these differences in cultures, coming from different religions and different tendency of being Orthodox, creates a lot of problem and to some extent a low level of willingness to give, low level of willingness to pay taxes, and it's about the same, even greater problem in countries like the US and some countries in Europe. Okay, so now I want to talk about the mechanism for generating these willingness to give, generating these emotional, rational emotions to some extent that are associated with giving and cooperation, even when cooperation is non-beneficial from a point of view of payoffs, right? And I'm going to talk mainly about oxytocin. Oxytocin is an outstanding hormone that was discovered several decades ago by looking at cats and the fact that they become more aggressive after delivery when somebody approaches their offsprings, okay? And it is now known that the level of oxytocin in our blood goes up substantially among women when they are pregnant, and even more so when they deliver, or alternatively for us men and women together when we fall in love. It's also called the love hormone. Okay? Very interestingly, also men, when their wife or their partner give birth, their level of oxytocin goes up. Okay? So there are psychological mechanisms that affect the level of this hormone. This hormone is also serving as a medicine, because the other function that it provides is the contraction during the delivery that are very essential. And some women that lack this contraction are getting this as a medicine to facilitate the delivery, to make it faster. Okay? Now, about 20 years ago, economists started to run experiments by administering these drugs to subjects. This is a very benign drug, have no side effect, and all these experiments are done in a way that some of the subjects get the true drug, some of them get the placebo, and the placebo is actually has the same taste, the same smell, everything, but it doesn't contain the active substance. Okay, and what you see is that people who were administered this drug trust other people more than those who took the placebo. How do you measure it? There is a very, very famous game called the trust game that has been played in experiment hundreds of times. It's very simple. You take two individuals, you give one of them a certain amount of money, let's say 100 euro, okay? And then the person who has the money can decide how much of this is giving to the other person. He can give either nothing, or he can give 20, or he can give everything. Whatever he gives will be multiplied by the experiment, by 3. Okay? So if he gives 20, the other person will see 60 in his pocket. If he gives the entire amount, 100, the other person will see 300. Okay? And then the second person who got the money can decide how much to give back, okay, as a gratitude to the person who transferred him the money. Okay? Now, if you have full trust, if you are the one who has to transfer, and you have a full trust in the other person, how much would you give? The entire 100, right? And the other person will have 300, and if he's fair, he will give you half of it. You'll end up with 150, which is 50 more than what you started with. Okay? If you have zero trust in the other person, obviously you would give nothing, because the other person is not compelled to give anything back. Okay? What they found out is that those people who got the oxytocin delivered much more, transferred much more in the trust game. Okay? And that was the first hint that this hormone has something to do with trusting. Not only with trusting, to some extent also with generosity. There are two diseases that are associated with this hormone, with oxytocin. One of them is autism, which many of you know, I guess. And this is a disease that, among other things, the main failure is to communicate or engage emotionally with other people. And this is associated with very low levels of oxytocin in the blood. On the other hand, there is this disease called the Williams syndrome. The Williams syndrome is a much more complicated disease that also have some biological consequences that in the stomach that are very problematic. But from a psychology point of view, those parents that raise those kids that have Williams syndrome report that they enjoy raising them much more than their other kids which are normal, because they manage to create such an amazing attachment to the parents that no normal kid managed to do. Okay? But the main problem is that these attachment and these trust that they award the parents with, they basically also award with anybody else, any stranger. So it's very important not to let them walk around the streets alone, because they can very easily abused. Okay, and this phenomenon is associated with high level of oxytocin. Okay. So what I want to do now, I want to do a quick break here and discuss with you a related issue of rational emotions. For rational emotions to be effective, it is required not only that we will be able to generate emotions, genuine emotions in strategic situations that can affect the situation, but also that the person with whom we interact will be able to recognize our emotions correctly. If emotions serve as a device of commitment and a signal, it ought to be understood by the other party. If the other party doesn't understand it, okay, or if the other party cannot distinguish between imitation and genuine emotions, then the whole purpose of becoming an emotional in strategic situation vanishes. Okay? So one of the research projects that I was engaged with my colleagues was to study the extent by which we are able to recognize emotions of other parties and derive predictions about what they will do. Okay? So I'm going to show you a very short clip that on which our experiment was based. This is a clip of a game, a TV game that was very popular in the UK called Split or Still. The game starts with trivia questions that the two individuals solve together, and through which they accumulate a lot of money. You'll see quite a bit of money. And in the second stage, they have to divide this amount between themselves. And the way to divide it is that each of them has to decide simultaneously whether he splits or steals. If both of them split, then they divide it 50-50 between themselves. If one of them split and the other one steals, the one who stole gets the entire amount, and the other one gets nothing. If they both steal, everything's go away, and they both get nothing. And before they make this decision, they have basically 30 seconds to deliberate between themselves what they are going to do. Okay, so I want you to look at it. Ah, sorry, this is not the one.
Okay, this is serious, life-changing work in jackpot today.
Do you hear? Do you know how? Let me see. Okay.
We're now going to play split or steal. I know you're the last two people in the country I have to explain this to, but you have two final golden balls. You each have a golden ball with the word split written inside. You each have a golden ball with the word steal written inside. You will make a conscious choice of choosing the split or the steal ball. If you both choose the split ball, you split today's jackpot of £100,150 and you go home £50,075. If one of you splits and one of you steals, whoever chooses the steal ball will go home with £100,150. And the person who chooses the split ball goes home with nothing. If you both choose the steal ball, you go home with nothing. Okay? Before I ask you to choose, I want you to look at your two golden balls and make sure you know which is the split ball and which is the steal ball. This is very important. Make sure you don't show each other. Before I ask you to choose, I think you have some talking to do to each other.
Stephen, I just thought they weren't puppy dog tears and they were real tears and you were genuinely going to split that.
I am going to split this. That's 50,000. It's unbelievable. I'm very, very happy to go with
You were
50,000.
genuinely going to split.
If I stole off you, every single person there would run over here and lynch me.
There was no way I could, everyone who knew me would just be disgusted if I stole.
When people watch this, they're not going to believe it.
Please.
I can look you in me, sir, I can look you straight in the eye and tell you I'm going to split. I swear down, I'm going to split.
This is serious, mate. It is.
So usually I stop here and go to a different issue, but no, I'm joking. I know you will kill me if I do it. But maybe before I show you the continuation, maybe we'll do a very short poll here and ask people what they think. Let's start with him. How many think you will choose split? How many think you will choose steal? How about her? How many think she will choose split? How about steal? Okay, so you're a bit pessimistic, huh?
Sarah, Steve, choose either the split or the steal ball now. Hold it up.
We're going on with 50 grand each, I promise you that.
Split or steal?
It's not that easy to make prediction in this game. Here, you had some hints. If you play this video again, you will notice that she never promised that she will play split. He said so several times, repeatedly, I'll play split and so forth. She said, she almost started saying, there's no way I can, and then she went back and said, if I choose steal, everybody here and so forth. Okay, but she never explicitly say that, that she will choose split. Now, in spite of this, both of them, as you noticed, used a lot of signals in their body movement, in their voice intonation, facial posture, and many other ways. And what we did is we got our subject into the lab. We collected about 24 episodes like this. There's also an American version called Friends and Foes. And we let them look at it, and we stop it precisely at the point when I stop it for you and ask you to make prediction. And our subject got some money for every correct prediction. So they had to predict what these people will do. And we started this in a natural, sort of a natural environment without oxytocin, and later I'll tell you what oxytocin did. Okay, and what we found out is that they do much better than just guessing. So people also, by watching it from outside, I mean, you can be mistaken in several of them, but overall, if you compute their prediction and you ask what would they have gotten if they just guessed, you see that they did much better than guessing. Okay? So this already gives some hints about the fact that those signals cannot be completely deceptive, right? So in the same way, people cannot perfectly identify the mental stage of other people. Nobody can perfectly deceive other people by manipulating emotions. Okay, they have all the incentives to manipulate each other, right? And they can't. One other finding, which is not mine but other people, is that if you draw the matrix and there are, let's say, two split and still, split and still. Now you can take all the people who play in the game, okay, and write the proportions of each pair in each of these 4 cells, okay? You know, if you study statistics, even in an elementary course, you know that if there is independence between the action of the first guy and the second guy, this distribution should cover the entire square. But very interestingly, most of the distribution is on the diagonal. So it is the case that most of them play either still or split. And this is fascinating because it says that they can read each other's mind. Okay, in spite of the attempts of each of them to deceive the other one, of course, in most episodes they try to convince each other that they will play split. They don't always play split, not only in this one, but in many others they play still. But whenever they play still, they play very, very prominently still, which means that if you intend to play still, I will discover it. Again, by the way you move with your body, you won't be able to deceive me. Okay, so this is quite fascinating. What we did then is we introduced the oxytocin. We wanted to see how oxytocin change because of the known role of oxytocin to create trust. We wanted to see if this does have some effect on people's ability to recognize the mental states of other people. And what we found out is that people who got the oxytocin, as opposed to those who got the placebo, did much worse in predicting. And they did much worse in predicting in a very special way. They did worse because they decided very quickly about their prediction. They actually didn't want to engage in this task. They had much more, let's say, mental cost of managing this task by which you are asked to predict the other person's action. Why is it that the oxytocin made them so reluctant to engage in this task? Again, when is it that you are asked, when you find yourself requested, possibly by yourself, to make predictions about what other person will do. Only when you distrust the other person, only when you suspect him or her, okay? But if you believe in the other person, you find the task of trying to figure out what the person will do much more unsatisfactory, much more difficult. Because the brain is basically telling you, listen, you trust this person, or oxytocin will tell you to avoid engage in activities that are common to the case where you suspect somebody, not when you trust him. It's actually, the oxytocin will actually tells you, you know, your brain is endowed with so many tasks. I'll give you, with so many tasks, use your resources to do other things with your brain, not figure out what other people are doing. Yes?
So these guys were also more likely to anticipate split, yes?
No. So the way they acted is that they used the standard stereotype for trusting or not trusting, okay? So they attributed much more trust to women, for instance, than those who got the oxytocin, okay? They thought, hey, she's a woman, she should be trusted, this is a man, okay? So this was part of choosing very quickly. Okay, so what do you do if you have to choose very quickly? You base your decision on stereotypes, okay, which is exactly what they did. Okay, so this is a paper I wrote with a brain researcher at the Hebrew University. We published it in Psychological Science, which is a well-known outlet in psychology. But it then appeared in some of the daily newspapers in Israel, and some journalists have gone through an additional stage, which may well be true in interpreting these results, although we didn't test it. This is indeed something to test. I told you that oxytocin appears in high doses in our body when we fall in love. Okay, and one of the conclusions of the journalists that reported on these results is that they call it love lies. Okay, in the sense that be aware, if you are in love, you are much more easily manipulated. We know this fact that we are very much in love with somebody. We tend to ignore the weaknesses of the other party. Okay, we tend to focus on the strengths, on the things that we like. Okay, this is one phenomenon, and what they are claiming is that possibly this would also apply with people, not with your partner, but people outside your relationship, okay? It will just take me 1 minute just to warn you about something. So you now may ask, if oxytocin is so good, why don't we subscribe it to people when they start negotiating? Why wouldn't you take it with you to your next contracts, when you sign a contract on apartment rental or something like that? And indeed there is something that you can buy over the internet called the liquid trust, and in the instruction they tell you, they suggest to you to, you know, the next date you're going, or alternatively a business meeting, don't forget to take it with you. I would say it's very much, I would not recommend it for two reasons. First, if it's going to be effective, they suggest to spray it. It's going to be effective. It will affect you maybe before it will affect your counterpart. Okay, so we potentially don't want that. And secondly, because it's over the counter, it's traded freely without FDA approval or anything like that, it suggests that it doesn't have substantial active material to do anything, okay? But there is something else that will do the job, and this is hugging, okay? We know that by hugging, we generate oxytocin in a very natural way, okay? And this is very much recommended. Thank you. I think I'll stop here. If you have questions, I'll be glad to address them.
So, are there questions?
Just, have you done an intercultural studies, comparing different cultures with?
Yes, we did. And I have a chapter on that in the book. I was at the EUI, as Micha mentioned, and EUI is an institute that accommodates students from all places in Europe. And we got some research grant with which we conducted cross-cultural experiments with students coming from different nationalities, okay? And we found very interesting results. I won't tell you, I'll keep it secret, but we found very strong cultural / national effects in trusting one another. And then I did another experiment jointly with Reinhard Zelten, who is a Nobel laureate, where we got together Israelis and Palestinians to play trust game. And also there we found very, very interesting results, and you'll be able to read it in the book.
So, I would like...
Yeah.
Okay, you try to convince us that emotions help. You try to convince us that emotions help make better decisions. Now the question is regarding political decisions. So
Good question.
Let's take 2 elections in the United States and in the UK. Elections where emotions played extremely high role, and do you think that let's say the votes were really better because of this? Emotions?
This is an excellent question. I was hoping to get it. And I actually wrote, Micha mentioned a few press articles that I've written in The Guardian and in the Washington Post and Time Magazine on these, precisely on these issues. One of them I did after the election in the UK. And my overall statement was that unlike individual emotions, I have a chapter in which I call collective emotions. And collective emotion, it's what really is invoked in national elections, in political engagement and things like that. And there, we unfortunately behave very, very irrationally. We behave irrationally because most of our decision about who to support and whether to support anybody is group behavior. We do things because we want to associate to a certain group, okay? And this desire to be part of a group often is being realized or intensifies only when the group is facing conflict with other group. Okay, so although being part of the group, being part of the collective, wanting to help to your group, which is a very basic evolutionary trait, is very often very useful because it makes people want to do this giving that I demonstrated here. On the other hand, it intensifies conflicts, okay? And it intensifies conflict, and our association with the group is very strange very often, is very peculiar. I used to ask my student in Jerusalem whether they are proud to be Israeli, okay? And many of them answer, of course, and when you ask them, so tell me why. So sometimes they mention that Israel has a very high proportion of Nobel laureates relative to the population. They mention the fact that we are called a startup nation, that we donate kidneys altruistically more than other nations. And I said, okay, that's good reasons. And then I asked, now, are you ashamed, let's say, because of the murder, because Israeli murdered the Prime Minister Rabin? And then the reaction is, why should I be ashamed of anything that somebody else is doing? Okay? So I ask, so you're not ashamed, but you are proud of the Nobel laureates in Israel, right? So it must be that you're one of them. Otherwise, you should have been ashamed about somebody else doing something. So very often you see, and this is, I think applies to not only to Israel, to many countries, that people, and this is very often more prevalent among the right than the left. People want to be proud of their nation, but they don't want to be ashamed of what their nation has done or the event that the nation was involved with. And my saying is, you can't be proud. You can't be proud without being ashamed, right? Because being proud is making yourself part. Being proud is making yourself part of, to some extent, is identifying yourself with the collective, right? And if you identify with the collective, you can't pick up the things you want to be identified. If you consider yourself patriotic, it means that you have to take the package deal, not single out the things you want to be proud of because you are American, because you are German, because you are Polish. You have to take the entire package altogether.
Another question? Yeah.
Have you done any research combining investigating trust and risk aversion?
Not me, but there are there are some research, other people who did research in this direction, okay, and I think one of the interesting aspects in this research is that if you think about the trust game, then giving money is a risky entrepreneur, right? We call it strategic risk because you're giving money, you don't know how much you will give back. Okay? But interestingly, people who are more risk averse would tend to trust more other people. I think it's counterintuitive, but it has been discovered. If I remember, I cannot point at the moment at the specific paper, but I think the reason is that being risk averse or trustful is part of a much larger set of traits that distinguish one person from another. Okay, and you can find correlation which, on the face of it, will make no sense, but if you look at the personality altogether, it might make sense.
So, one more question is that it seems that it's very important that you control emotions, not only that which emotions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
The thing is that sometimes I know that by being happy, let's say, being in a good mood, I could perform better.
Yeah.
But I cannot influence.
You cannot influence it.
People who have depression or things like that. So
well, depression is anomalies. Depression is a different story. But but this is already getting to, some people in lectures that I give in various places ask me, okay, so what is the take-home suggestion that you can make here? And my book was not written like an instruction book, you know, here is five ideas to become happy, yeah? But nevertheless, I think there is a take-home message that connects to what Micha said, and this is being tuned to one's emotion, okay? Being tuned to one's emotions, you know, we think of emotions as being something spontaneous, but I just gave you some examples in which emotions are something that we generate. And by being able to put the finger on these cases when we actually generate them, allow us to control them. So if we find ourselves in a situation where we generate anger because it might help us, and we put the finger on it, we're able to ask the second question is whether we've gone too far in being angry to the extent that it stopped being effective for us, but start being burdensome, okay? Work against our interest. And by being aware of it, by thinking about it and analyzing it, I think we actually can, to some extent, control our emotions. Because they are generated by incentives, they can also be controlled and moderated by understanding the incentives behind it. Okay? So the mere fact that we are aware of where emotions are coming and what is the mechanism by which determine to a large extent how we feel about situations, by the mere fact that we know it and we can analyze it, I think it allows us to control it much more easily.
Okay, one more question. Yeah.
In the beginning, you were telling us about this experiment when you were getting people angry. But if both parties were angry, then no one would have an advantage. So it makes sense, perhaps, if some people, more generally, perhaps this logic about anger being there to facilitate you, to increase your chances, makes sense, perhaps, if people are heterogeneous with respect to their ability to evolve.
You have a correct point. I mean, the way to describe it, but the thing is that the way to describe this emotional game is very much like the prisoner's dilemma, okay? If we are, both of us, engaged in a situation, for both of us, being perfectly rational and cold is not a good strategy. Every one of us can do slightly better by being slightly less rational. On the other hand, when both of us are irrational, both of us are losing from it. So if there would have been somebody like in the prisoner's dilemma, if there would have been somebody who can force us to cooperate, we would have been better off. But lack of somebody like this, lack of our ability to coordinate, okay? If you perform anger and I am fully rational and cold, you will have an advantage over me. You will have an advantage over me. By the way, one other topic I wrote about is the entire political negotiations or diplomatic negotiations that have been taken in the past between countries in the West and countries in countries in the West, and for instance, Iran. Okay, if you remember the negotiation over the nuclear deal with Iran, you will notice that they have taken the emotional strategy very explicitly. Okay, very explicitly from the first time they were saying we will not be humiliated. They used the terms humiliation and anger and all of this, and God's support to our position very explicitly. These are all tying my hands behind our back. On the other hand, the US was choosing more rational approach. One very poor outing by Barack Obama was very publicly when he said, we are not going to get the Iranian down on their knees, reacting to, and basically every proposal that they were making at the beginning of the negotiation was met by a statement, the Iranian statement, that they are insulted. And indeed they came up much stronger because of this strategic approach, okay? The US and the West could have also adopt an emotional strategy. For instance, there is enough to be angry at Iran, for instance, saying that we have our principle of human rights and we will not let ourselves be humiliated by caving in to dealing with a country that kill or execute homosexuals. That could be an emotional attitude, okay? And if the West would have taken slightly more emotional attitude and less cold and super rational attitude within these negotiations, I think they would come up with a much better deal. Thank you very much.